Well, we're in the book of Genesis, and we have been watching the up and down roller coaster life of Joseph. He's been riding high, and now it appears that God is really working on his emotions as he's being reunited with his brothers, but they don't even realize they're being reunited with Joseph. It's a really interesting section of Scripture because we find that there's a lot of dynamics here going on and a lot of lessons to learn. Go back and get your younger brother Benjamin and bring him back. On the way back, they find that the money they paid for the grain has been put in their sacks along with the grain. And we know that there's a lot of emotions that are going on here as they wonder how this all happened. And we know that there's a lot of dynamics of sin and sin being ever before you, and the the joy of Reuben saying, "I told you so," or karma, or sow what you reap, reap what you sow. Nevertheless, he warned them not to do what they did to Joseph, and he has a chance to say, "I told you so." It's quite an interesting thing because I think all of us have had times when we've wanted to say that to somebody, "I told you so." In any case, we come back and we know that Simeon has been bound and held as the surety, if you will, for the other brothers to come back and bring Benjamin with them. It's not what Jacob or Israel wants to do, and it gets a little confusing in most translations. They keep backing back and forward between Jacob and the name Israel. God changed his name to Israel, but we find that the scriptures keep changing it back and forth. Gets a little confusing. But we certainly know that we see Joseph's tender heart. We see him weeping over this reunion and over seeing his brothers, and we certainly understand Jacob's concern that he'll lose all of his children if he's not careful. They report all of the things that have happened to Jacob and tell him about all of the things that have happened, and Jacob seems to take on a negative thought pattern here. He seems to think the worst instead of the best. He seems not to be trusting God in the way he responds to the boys and the way he thinks about sending Benjamin along with them for more grain. Nevertheless, we find this is one of those times when Jacob thinks that you can buy friendship and you can't. But he decides to send the boys back with a bunch of gifts to hopefully find favor with this man that's selling the grain, not knowing that's his own son his own son Joseph. And so we find this attempt then to win favoritism by gifts. When the boys get back, this time they're asked to come to Joseph's house. They think this is going to be the end of all things because they think that Joseph perhaps is upset about the fact that they got the money and the grain. They go with fear and trembling. However, they do confess the fact that the money and the grain were both in the sacks. Confession is good for us, and even though they do it in light of the fact that they feel like they may have already been found out that the money were in the sacks, they do confess. And we see the conversation kind of change to a spiritual tone because Joseph says that the reason that the money and the grain was there is the God of your father and your God has given this treasure to you. I think that's very interesting. I think that Joseph is the one that changes the conversation to spiritual and doesn't take any credit for giving back their money and the grain as well, but gives all the credit to God. Once again, in verse 26, we see them bowing before Joseph, again fulfilling the prophecy that Joseph had as a much younger lad, that they would bow down before him. And we see Joseph's spirit stirred. We see him weeping again. Not the first time that he's wept. This is now the second time that we've seen him wept. In chapter 42, verse 24, and chapter 43, verse 30, we find the tenderness of Joseph's heart. And I think that has to remind us of the fact that when we see in the following scriptures that God is looking for a king for Israel, that he chooses David because he says God doesn't look at the outward appearance, but he looks at the heart. And we see why God seems to have chosen Joseph, because he looks at the heart of Joseph, sees that tenderness, that forgiveness, that merciful, that heart of grace, and it would appear that God certainly looked at Joseph's heart. And we finally close out this particular section of Scripture with a sad note, because we see that prejudice is not something new to this world. It says when they had this meal with Joseph at his house, that the Egyptians sat at one table and the Hebrews sat at another, because the Egyptians had such great prejudice against the Hebrews. And we know in future days we'll see the tremendous prejudice that the Hebrews had for both Samaritans and Gentiles. Prejudice has no place in this world. God doesn't show any prejudice based on gender, based on ethnicity. God has no room for prejudice in our lives. So let's take a look at 7 incredible applications for this section of Scripture. I want to encourage you to read your walk through the Bible, your chronological Bibles, or whatever you're doing in reading through the Bible in a year. And I hope that you'll read over these 2 chapters again, chapter 42 and 43. But the first thing is I want you to remember the tenderness of Joseph's heart. God looks at the heart. What does he see when he sees your heart and your attitudes? Number 2, you can't outgive God. They came down to buy grain and went back and found they not only got their grain, but they got their money back. I'm reminded of a wonderful lesson that a pastor taught me when Lois and I were getting married. As most pastors don't have a fee that they set for doing a wedding, our pastor did not have a set fee for doing a wedding. And we prayed about what we should give him for doing the wedding, and we were quite generous with our gift to give to him for doing our wedding. But when we were back in our home after the wedding and after the honeymoon, we were going through the cards and the things that people had given to us from the wedding, and we found a card from our pastor. And inside that card was the very envelope that we had given to him. It was unopened, and a little note that said, your generosity will come back to you, and what you have given to me, I have given to you as a wedding gift. And so when we were very generous to him, he was very generous to us, but he didn't even know how generous he had been in returning what we had paid him, feeling that he had been a significant spiritual factor in our lives. What a wonderful way for a pastor to teach people, to disciple people about not giving to get, but giving with a generous heart, but then to know that that'll come back to you. And I followed that practice for a number of years myself in my own ministry with couples that would get married. I would take their envelope, whatever they had, and I had no set fee for doing a wedding. I would take that envelope of whatever they gave me, put it in an envelope and return it back to them as a wedding present, hoping to pay it forward, if you will, and to teach others, disciple others about giving and about how God blesses and receives back. And I couldn't help but to think about that when I thought about those boys opening the grain and finding not only the grain, but what they had paid for it. Well, that's a great lesson for all of us. Then the third lesson is, don't always imagine the worst. Poor old Jacob, he's imagining the worst. He doesn't know that God is working behind the scenes to bless him and to bless his children. And then we find, fourthly, the commitment that both Reuben and Judah make, and the willing to sacrifice in order to assure Jacob that they will bring Benjamin back safe and sound. We need to have a commitment and a belief in God that we will be able to accomplish what he set us out to accomplish. And they show their commitment. Again, a discipleship trait that all of us need to understand. There has to be commitment behind all the actions that we take. Then sixthly, we need to be sure that we understand that confession is good for the soul. Instead of saying that they didn't get the money back for the grain, they admitted that they got the money back for the grain, and they had come back not only with that money, but more money to buy grain. And confession is always good for the soul. It's good for us to get out our confessions. You'll find that in chapter 43, verse 21. And finally, of course, the point that I made earlier, and that is, there's no room in this world for prejudice. It doesn't matter about economic level of life, doesn't matter gender, doesn't matter color of skin, doesn't matter what our religious preferences are. There's no room for prejudice in this world. And God doesn't want us to be prejudiced and to be separated. So I hope that you'll look at all of those possible applications for your life out of these two chapters, and that you'll apply them to your life and live it out daily as a disciple of Christ. That's my thought for the day. God bless you. Have a great day. This is one of the best thought-provoking jokes that I've seen in a long time, so I hope you'll take time